Hello and welcome everyone to our Common Read conversation with Rohadi Nagassar, author of When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. My name is Alyssa Bennett-Smith and I'm the Digital Marketing Manager at Menno Media and Herald Press. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Before I introduce our guest, just a couple of notes for everyone. First, Rohadi's book is available now everywhere books are sold. And each time a common read is selected, customers can receive 30% off orders of 4 or more copies on mennomedia.org. And Canadian customers can receive 20% off orders of 5 or more copies at CommonWord.ca. As luck would have it, When We Belong and several other great books are on sale on mennomedia.org this week for 40% off as a part of our celebration of Pastor Appreciation Month. So if you order before this coming Monday, you can save a little bit of extra money, but if not, those other regular discounts are available all throughout this fall. Second, there's a free downloadable study guide that Rohadi wrote to accompany the book. And it's perfectly written for either individual study or group discussions. And there's a link on the book page at mennomedia.org, as well as on the study guides page of heraldpress.com. I've just added the links to purchase the book and download the study guide to the chat. And they'll be listed in the video description for those who are watching the recording of this after the fact. And lastly, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll find a button for Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions there at any time throughout the conversation, and we'll answer those at the end. Okay, we can get started. All the housekeeping's done. So I'd like to offer a warm welcome to Rohadi Nagassar. Thank you for joining us tonight. Rohadi is a writer, entrepreneur, nonprofit developer, and pastor. He lives on Treaty 7 land in Calgary, Alberta, and has written extensively in areas of anti-racist discipleship, deconstruction, decolonizing the church, church planting and revitalization, and tons more. When We Belong is his 4th book, and he has a podcast called Faith in a Fresh Vibe. And information about all of his work can be found on his website, rohadi.com. So thanks again for joining us tonight. And do you want to share a little bit more about yourself, your background, and just a little bit about you?
Well, thanks, Alyssa, for inviting me and for having me on this is it a show? Do we call it a show?
We do these quarterly, so.
The quarterly show. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, a little bit about me. Well, I moved to Canada from Trinidad when I was really young, and I've been in Calgary ever since. And so, the Treaty 7 territory, the treaty signers, the Indigenous nations who signed the treaty in this particular region, on this land, it's Treaty 7 territory, and also Métis Region 3. Not all territory in Canada is treaty territory. Some is unceded. And so it's important, and I include some reasons why in the book, to acknowledge the lands on which we are situated on and the first peoples from those lands, because it's integral, I think, to our formation and also how we live in the here and now. I've been in Calgary for 37 plus years and grew up mostly in the church. From a young age, went to what I would now call a charismatic church where folks were speaking in tongues. All of that didn't matter to me so long as I got my little comic insert from the picture Bible. And that was it. And so the picture Bible, and I do unpack like pages of it in the book of how formative something like that is onto wee minds like mine, and how all the characters portrayed in a certain way just sort of stick in the back of your mind as you picture the biblical stories. So I grew up there and then switched to an evangelical church. What I would now call a white evangelical tradition. And that was where I was in my formative years until I left that church for university and then went to seminary right after university in an evangelical tradition. And that's where things, ironically, in seminary and also my experience as a visible minority, which is what the term we use in Canada more so, and how I could belong in churches that were around me, contemporary churches. I quickly pivoted from seminary when I was done into the only place where I could find space or where I could live out and work with my gifts. And that was to church plant, because there was no spaces or places within the church traditions that I was a part of in evangelicalism that would have welcomed me to lead, to start churches, to be a part of church leadership. It would have been a space that probably would have demanded a significant amount of assimilation from my part to belong. So that's the church side of things. Growing up in Western Canada, Alberta is sort of the, on a good day, it's the Texas of Canada. On a bad day, it's the Florida of Canada. Those are, I guess, contemporary ways we describe ourselves. So a lot of what happens in the church world, in the contemporary church world, especially evangelicalism here, is borrowed from America. And so we don't look that much different. There are far fewer evangelicals, far fewer of all traditions. Um, but the way what we read, what we believe are all basically borrowed, taken from the US. So formation wise, a lot of similarities. So that's what shaped and formed me right before I got into church planting and sort of branched off on my own, and gives a sense of context of what shaped and formed the way I used to think, and also what drove me into the places and spaces that altered the way that I both see the world, but also understand my faith.
Definitely. Thank you. So that sort of leads up to my first question. So when you were sort of forming your ideas around writing the book and thinking about what you wanted to communicate, who were the main audience or audiences that you had in mind, and what were your sort of hopes in writing that you would want people to sort of take away or be able to gain from what you were putting together?
Yeah. As all books or authors, writers, all writers know that when you put together a book, it alters and changes and morphs and becomes something completely different. Initially, this book was a book to church leaders, and the answer that I started with the answer of the problem I was trying to figure out was belonging in a sense, but how we could create church spaces for belonging across ethnicities. And so rather than racialized segregation, which is kind of the case in most churches, what does it look like to be more diverse? And so multi-ethnic churches was the answer. But that was way too narrow, and I wasn't totally convinced that that was the answer to what I was really searching for. And so, in many respects, the book became more memoir-ish. Is that a word? It became more of a memoir about my own journey as a multi-ethnic person, not fitting into any particular ethnicity where I could land, and obviously not white, and so not belonging in white churches either, and figuring out, okay, what does faith look like for me, and specifically, what do the church spaces look like where I could belong? And so that spurred questions of both trying to tease out what was producing the barriers to belonging,
Mhm.
but it also forced me to ask who else. So it's not just my story, it's in fact those who've been pushed to the margins. And at that point in the writing process, I realized that this was a book that I started, an idea of a book, 7, 8 years ago. All of in my writing process, my books all have different notepads. Every book idea has their
Oh
own
yeah.
notebook. And so this notebook, I just had the starting idea and a title for some reason. And the title was Remarkable on the Fringe.
Mm.
of all these remarkable people who were defying odds and eking out their own belonging in places and spaces where they really shouldn't. They were kind of the overcomers, and we all love a story of overcoming. And so I wanted to write something in that vein, but left the idea. And as I was finishing When We Belong, I realized that as I was writing to an expansive audience of all those who have been pushed to the margins by some dominant trait and specifically I look at the church, but it can be in society as well. But all those who've been pushed to the margins, all are looking for ways to belong. And so suddenly the book took on a life where it was anyone who has encountered or that ain't right. So a moment that wasn't right in your church experience, anyone who had come up against a barrier specifically around belonging, this book now was for you. And so now that starts to fold in all of the stories of people who not merely came against some aspect in church community that worked against their beliefs, something they just knew inside of them, well, that's not right, but also those who are being pressed against some aspect in their body or in their self that is not part or does not have a space where you can be your whole self in church community. So I think not everyone, there are a lot of people who don't fit the dominant gaze in both specific churches, but also church traditions or denominations, who at some point have said, this isn't right. Something inside of me is pushing up against a demand to really assimilate. So I agree with that for the reader. I say, yeah, you're right. That ain't right. And it could be a belief, something simple like theological end times. It could be something around intersections, and there are many. It could be gender, for example. Why, in particular traditions, can't women be leaders and pastors? And why are our traditions predominantly led by men? It could be sexuality. Why are queer folks pushed to the margins of society? Why is heteronormativity the norm? And one of the key aspects that I interrogate in the book is what I think is one of the foundations, one of the foundational barriers that inhibit belonging, and is and part of the DNA in most churches in the West, and that's white supremacy. And so I tell the story predominantly around the lines of racialized segregation and the problems of white supremacy or white superiority in church traditions, and also with a dash of patriarchy. Although patriarchy, I think, is both built in a different place, but also lands at the feet of white supremacy as well. So all of the normalcy that is built within white supremacy and has shaped and formed church traditions, that is who I am writing for. Those who have been pushed aside by that particular foundation and power. And so that becomes expansive. It can be anyone, but it's certainly those who have noted that they don't fit anymore in their faith traditions and are wondering, is there an option left for me?
For sure. And you're so right. There are so many different ways in which people can arrive at that place, and so many different reasons and identities that are made to feel that way in our various churches and communities. You mentioned belonging, and obviously it's in the title of the book, so it's pretty central to what you're talking about. I'm curious how you sort of define that idea, or what paradigm you use to think about it in terms of how it comes to pass in our communities. What does that look like, and how do we avoid falling into or developing expectations for unhealthy forms of belonging, which you talk about a little bit in the book. And I guess you've sort of already gotten into a little bit of how we sort of default to unhealthy forms of belonging in a lot of ways because of those unequal structures that our institutions are built around: white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, all of these things. So when we look at those and we're trying to dismantle them, how then do we shift our view of belonging and
Yeah.
how we define that within our communities?
Yeah, and in a new way that's
Mhm.
more expansive and inclusive. Is the sun kind of doing weird things to the
Yeah, you're
screen?
sort of
Yeah.
flickering a little bit.
It's angelic in a way. Let me
Yeah.
now it'll be
Better.
super dark. Welcome to the basement. We're after hours now.
Ah.
Um Now I can't read my notes because it's too dark. That's okay. It's a good question. Belonging is something that I think is a lot of folks are lingering around right now, and some very popular contemporary writers like Brené Brown have written extensively around belonging, and so that kind of spurred my interest, not merely my own experience of struggling to belong, but Brené Brown. Um, it spurred my interest to challenge the assumptions because I have encountered a lot of folks who like her writings, but it's always struck me as too individualistic,
Mm.
that belonging um, is about whether or not you can belong to yourself, which which is true, which is true. I think there's some deep, important work that we have to do to figure out how we might belong to ourselves. But the problem of belonging isn't fixed if we just figure out how to belong to ourselves. Now, this is my take, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And I know there are many writers and thinkers out there who might stop there and be like, actually, that's it. Can you belong to yourselves? Because if you do, then you can belong anywhere. But I've always had a problem with that through a colonial lens, um, that just because you think you belong somewhere, you can. I
Mm.
think there's an invitation that needs to come with that. I think, in fact, belonging is far more expansive and holistic than merely belonging to ourselves. That's where it starts. I think there is a need for us to be okay in our own skin, but we also need a certain kind of affirmation from those around us, not an affirmation where our belonging is tied to whether or not we receive what is often fleeting affirmations from those outside us, but one that says, we affirm you to live out the fullness of who you are, the fullness of who you are in all of your uniqueness in the context of community. I think that's really different and far more expansive than just belonging to ourselves.
Mm.
So I use the example of love, as the great commandment in the scriptures, and note that love is expansive. And so it has these different components. So there's of course just the love component and just love. But then there's specific pieces that make it even bigger. There's a love for God. There's a relationship, in fact, there. There's a love that is really difficult. Christians called to love thy enemy. Like, we have a tough time loving, and here's another part, our neighbor, let alone our enemy. There is a love for one another. And if we read through the Gospel of John, we have these pieces of love God, love one another, love the neighbor, and love the neighbor as ourselves. So there is a self component in there as well. And so all of these pieces, I think, highlight a fundamental element of belonging, which is relationship. And that when we are in right relationship between things, we are glimpsing aspects of, I think, shalom, which is we're glimpsing aspects of the seventh day when all things were right. I want more of that. There are problems, however, and inhibitors for us, um, preventing us from entering into spaces and places where we can be our whole selves. Liberation is a term that I use, and we'll get to that later. So I think belonging is really connected to the relational aspects of all those who are around us, including a relational piece between God. So there's a spiritual piece as well. And I bring in another aspect, which is important, and this is pulling from the indigenous teachers around me. Um, there is a relational component to how you belong to the land as well.
Mm.
And so there's a love aspect of how we might relate to ourselves, our enemy, to God, to our neighbor, and to one another, which is in the context of hopefully, but life-giving community or the church. And then there's also how we are connected to the literal lands on which we are situated on. So all those things together, I think, create an expansive picture of what belonging is. And now it's about exposing all the barriers and inhibitors that are preventing us from living out the fullness of ourselves in the context of life-giving community where we can belong.
That's really beautiful. Um, yeah, and you really smoothly led into my next question. So throughout the book, you talk about deconstruction, which is a word that a lot of us hear a lot in different Christian spaces, um, and how deconstruction leads to liberation. And that a part of that process is, and I'm quoting you here, reclaiming what gives life, discarding what does not, and creating beautiful tales.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about what that can look like, how you see liberation playing out in your life and in the world around you? And what are some things that you've been able to reclaim and discard to help in your deconstruction process?
I mean, I don't think I'm deconstructing in so much as I'm trying to now come into a place of rebuilding. I won't use the term reconstructing. Um, I use the term deconstruction in the book because it's hot right now. It wasn't originally in it. It was a late addition, in fact,
Hmm.
um, because it was so pertinent to what folks are now engaging with. A lot of people, I mean, if you're in churches right now, maybe you're not asking these questions, or if you are, you're asking them behind closed doors. But it's likely we can all think of folks who, like, if you have adult children who used to go to church, this is something that they're engaging with. Or especially those who've been pushed to the margins, who are either in church community now or have left, this is something that uh, we have engaged in. And so I think deconstruction in a simple form is just trying to make sense of the wrongs. That something has struck us individually, or we've seen someone we love, they have been put up against some system or person, and it has worked against their self, their body, their existence. um, that calls into question the aspects of our faith. And so I think we need room in our traditions to be able to ask good questions, and good questions to make sense of whether or not the way we've been shaped and formed in our faith, whether or not that's something that grants life. Does it give life unto ourselves and also unto others? Or does it demand a piece of yourself that you have to give up in order to fit in? So we know that that action is wrong, that it's not right. So I use that ain't right quite a bit in the book. Now we want to make sense of what is it that ain't right. And so we ask the questions, and there are many different approaches to deconstruction. I think it is the exercise of calling into question that which brings harm. And so when you find those pieces, you discard it. And that's the nice way I put in the book. I wanted to use trash it, just trash it, throw it away. I'm outside the institution, so that's easy for me to say and to be like, just throw it all away. I'm not advocating for churches or denominations to burn to the ground, or like there's no fear associated to deconstruction, especially if you're inside the institution. Deconstruction is not something to be feared. Rather, it's revealing the wounds that continue to harm others who are on the inside. And so I think that's good work. And it's also necessary work to find wholeness and liberation, especially for those on the margins. that we need to do the work to start to name the things that work against our ability to be whole and to live whole lives, and figure out after we name it what parts then of our faith are worthy to be kept. So that's the reclaiming part. I would advocate that in the journey of you escaping harms in the church, you don't have to give it all up. I give up options of belonging in the church, and one of them is actually leave, because that's actually a real pragmatic response that many have. You can't think of anything better to do to escape the harm, and unfortunately, maybe your whole life has been wrapped around, and your relationships have been wrapped around the church. You have to escape it all. You just leave it all. Leave, and that makes sense, and we need room for that. But I also want to call out from the abyss and say, you don't have to leave it all behind, that there are life-giving attributes, that the very faith that we have is a Jesus who is a Jesus on the margins. It is a Jesus who was under Roman occupation, whose central message was to love in its expansive way, and continuously had this message of the last shall be first and the first last. Like, this is the upside down kingdom that we have, that God wants to see come to pass in our day and age now, to turn ultimately all the wrongs right. And so somewhere within that story, there's a hope for us to reclaim. Like, we can capture those pieces, and they matter, and they are life-giving. And I argue later in the book that it matches, it satisfies the longings of our hearts, the longings that make us human. They find their satisfaction in Jesus. And of course, it's more expansive. There are other ways and other pieces to that as well, including community. So I think there's the work of naming what's bringing harm, trashing that. That's hard work to do. There is work of trying to identify what is worth reclaiming. And then what you do with that is, I think you start to create beauty. And so in my mind, it's any moment where we come out of this process of interrogating the harm, and we choose life after that, and make an attempt, like some aspect of, we try to do book club night, or share meals around the table with just a few faithful and forgiving friends. That is a beautiful tale. Like, there's beauty there that counts, and that could be it. That could be the expression now that not merely saves your soul away from Christianity or the harm that it brought, but it also opens the door to say, this is not only good and right, but it counts as whole Christian community. So all of those attempts, whether they be big or small, whether they be in church or just in the neighborhood, they all matter, and they're a part of writing more expansive, liberative tales of what it means to be Christian now in a modern world.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love you're bringing in the whole idea of the upside down kingdom and how we think about power, um, and how we function within systems that obviously have
Yeah.
a power structure in place. Um, so to that end, when we think about our internal systems, in chapter 10, you talk about authority and how you see a quick movement in the church away from the idea of inherited authority. And can you share a
Yeah.
bit about what you think that means for our churches, and what we're sort of transitioning toward, and how those changes may impact our communities, and how we can support one another through that process, and do so in a way that prioritizes that radical inclusivity that you're talking about?
Yeah. So the bold claim I make in the book is that the church is an impediment to wholeness, especially to those on the margins. If it's not to you, that's good. Maybe you're in a healthy church. It's possible. Or maybe you are the person that the church is trying to center at the expense of those on the margins. So I remember my grandma's church. I wasn't alive, but when my grandma used to go to church, and she went for a number of years, before I was around, It was that parish church, right? It was a time in society where everyone went to church. Canada actually had a higher rate of weekly attendance than America um, in the 50s. And so the church operated from the center of prestige. It had inherited cultural power where they just, in essence, sat there and assumed if anyone had questions about life, they would seek out the church for answers. So that's an inherited position of authority, that the pastor has a say in your day-to-day life just because they have pastor or reverend, right? Nowadays, it doesn't matter how many letters I have in front and after my name, they don't matter. Now, in some traditions, they do, of course. There are traditions where these aspects still hold. I'm not suggesting that we throw away. Maybe I kind of am. I'm saying that there's a better way for us to organize a community. And so, and the example that I think of, especially in a world where the church is no longer the center of attention, Canada's a little bit different than America, but a lot of metro areas in America would be in a post-Christian sort of space where the church has far less authority than it used to. Now, I believe any authority that we have with each other is actually relational. And so it's not about whether, I'll use my church as an example, whether or not I'm pastor or reverend doctor, or, those things don't matter if I don't have a relationship with those around me. I can't speak into someone's life about their marriage, about their faith, unless they have given me that permission to do so. And so that's slightly different than at least the initial assumed posture that the church and its leaders have often taken on. There is a new way, I think, to operate in a more decentralized approach for churches where we decenter power, most importantly, but we also figure out what it means to be relationally connected in such a way where we eliminate or we pull down aspects of hierarchy within church communities. Now, does that necessarily breed inclusive churches? I don't think it does. There is a huge hurdle in my opinion, for churches in the West to figure out what it means to be inclusive. As I mentioned off the hop, churches are predominantly racially segregated, and they still are. It's one of the last racially segregated spaces in America, and not a lot has changed. There's more multi-ethnic churches, but even then, denominations and those multi-ethnic churches are white-led, and usually white men. And ethnic churches are ethnic churches, right? So even within racially segregated churches, there are some that are doing better across different intersections. They might have openness to leadership, so women can be leaders. They might be affirming, and so there are places where the church is trying to figure out how to be more inclusive, but we're really struggling against some of the big barriers, and the chief one, I think, is white supremacy or racial segregation. There are great churches that are affirming that are still really racially segregated, not named as such, but they are. That's the reality. It's in our formation. I think it's in the DNA of churches to know what's comfortable, and sameness is what's comfortable. Mm-hmm. Creating something different that's far more inclusive is not. That goes against so much of our cultural upbringing and formation to know and to have the skills, particularly in leadership, around holding diverse space, holding diverse and inclusive space, and safe space for that matter. Like, if I'm still trying to figure it out, like, how is the predominantly white church going to just come and have it figured out? So I don't think that's necessarily a goal for most churches. I think when it comes to inclusion and specifically matters of justice, churches can be more intentional with their formation of working out one piece of the puzzle. And so that might be a church that's learning about anti-Blackness or trying to figure out matters of racialized segregation, how it's been formed in their tradition and in their own church history. That church could probably do good work surrounding anti-racist discipleship for themselves unto the purpose of justice. I think that's within reach. I don't think that church can necessarily become diverse. Diverse churches across the spectrum are ones that start off that way typically. And so it has that DNA to begin with. Doesn't make it easy by any stretch. But I think, and I'm biased because to wear the church planter hat, although no one calls me that, that's how you start new organizations. You can't do something within the institution that's totally different because institutions are designed to prevent change. They're not designed to change. And so it's the new thing, the new attempt, usually small, that begins, and that's the key, that starts with this fully inclusive, diverse DNA as a church or organization. And that has a chance. It has a chance, but it's still within our cultural space. And so, yeah, that's always work, but it's good work because we're all seeking wholeness and liberation. We're all seeking how to live out the fullness of our humanity. And communities are richer when they are more diverse and when they reflect especially the diversity that is around them. So big cities certainly count in that regard because they will have pragmatically that diversity. Rural churches, a little bit different, but you'll find different intersections to tangle with. So we're all on the path for liberation and wholeness and the fullness of life. And if you're not asking the questions around belonging, then maybe that church is built for you to center you. But for those who've been pressed to the margins, who have left or are on the inside thinking about leaving, there are options and there's hope. And that's something that the book brings forward, is a pathway, pathways, I should say. I don't give answers, but I give questions and options for us to explore, to figure out where we might find our liberation. You asked what that looks like liberation. What does that look like? It's the folks who have been, to use the term, in the closet around their sexuality and can find community that will embrace them fully for who they are. It's those who are disabled in our communities who can find full belonging in the body, that they are not a disabled part of the body. They are actually making the body whole with their presence, and the community comes around to figure out ways to do that. It is those who are neurodiverse finding out new pieces about themselves, and when they unlock aspects about themselves that they never knew before, that's liberation. When you walk into places where you find a deeper piece of your humanity, and that is fully connected into the hope that God has for us. It's to live out the fullness of our image-bearing beauty. And so liberation are these moments where we capture that and walk into it. And it's so life-giving to both. I mean, it's transformative when it happens for you, but also transforms when you can find those you're in relationship with doing the same.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Just a reminder to those who are with us that you can add questions to the Q&A. We're coming to the end of the questions that I have for Rohadi, so if you have any, please do share those, and we'll take some time at the very end and answer those. So I guess my sort of last question for you would be, trying to think of the right words to phrase this. I've so enjoyed hearing both the openness of it, that we sort of like can't write a prescription for everyone of how this works out in your community, because there are so many different contexts and so many different like histories that people are coming from, both within the sort of internal structures of the church and individually or communities that might come together outside of those formal um, Sunday gatherings or church building um, frameworks. So I guess what is, since the book came out earlier this year, what are maybe some growing edges that you've noticed either in your church or in communities that you've seen online or just in your local community that you feel live into that liberation or really exemplify um, the fruit of that work that we're talking about doing. I mean, you've just given several sort of hypotheticals, but I'm curious from your own personal experience if you have any that you relate to really closely.
So you're asking kind of who's doing it well?
Yeah, I guess to put it much more simply. But yeah, or just things that you've seen that you've seen the benefit of that work. Even, I mean, I don't want to say like hold someone up as like this is what we all should be doing, like as you were talking
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah, yeah.
how we can't really do that. But yeah,
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
have
yeah, yeah.
examples of folks who are really working at the liberative work of creating those spaces where people can belong, if you have any that
Yeah.
you
You
want
know
to
what? I
name.
think there was a time, I don't know if really talk about it in my book Thrive, but there was a time where I was like, yeah, online church ain't church. It was like 10 years ago. It's like, it's lazy. No, no, online church ain't church. And so I've changed. And then the pandemic has had me repent of such folly. Um, Online churches is an example where A, those who are far apart can come together. B, you can find community that looks, sounds, believes like you, especially in, even if you're in a big city, you may not find folks who think like you, but online has opened that door. It's also been a key vehicle for disabled folks to participate in community. And so for that reason, I don't know if like our church literally went from the spectrum of in-person movement, dance, like almost a club atmosphere, like that kind of closeness and the table. So we had shared meals to none of that,
Mhm.
into a place where it's all online. And even that, it's not that frequent. And so we're holding space as best we can around online space. We're trying to figure out aspects of disability justice. So, in some ways, like because I lead and we have some aspects of justice figured out, but there are other places where we're weak, and disability justice is one. We think about those things more, A, because it's near in our household, but also I think churches who are navigating the pandemic, that is a big piece of how are you postured in this pandemic place, and are you a space that's safe for disabled folks? We don't process that question, right? Um, Churches had a lot of interest, although the pandemic sort of clouded our in the intent with actions around justice and the work of anti-racism, anti-blackness to deal with that formation within churches. We're not doing great with that. And so churches that I think that are beyond, like in a different space, are ones that are indigenous led. I see a lot of different things happening. So there's a church, and none of these are big, but they're asking different questions and living in different ways, right? Different relationships, different questions in terms of what does it look to operate in a decolonized faith, and life giving. And then one more I would name, I don't know if I'm being specific enough. One more I would name is especially women of color and those who have been seriously pressed against in harmful ways by the institution, any institution, but we'll use the church institution. And we see like the nonstop rampant sexual abuse in churches, and how it's not being addressed. So, how communities for those who have been harmed are propping up to help one another and to hold space for one another, that gives me a lot of hope. Um, the generation, and I'm not old, but the generation behind me, and even saying that, makes me realize like where I'm situated in this world of church development. The generation behind me and the tools that they have, and the awareness they have around mental health and and like somatic theology, so the body and what you're feeling, like gives me a lot of hope because they are light years ahead of me, and light years ahead of generations of leaders. And so what is coming that is yet to be named or identified or even come out, it excites me. Again, I don't think it's going to be big. I think there's going to be an accumulation of small things that are doing amazing pieces in their neighborhoods and in their networks. Um, and so what can the church do, like an established conventional or contemporary church? What can you do? It's continue to celebrate the things that you are doing within community, and then also find the things that are happening in your community that you're not aware about, that you can come alongside and champion,
Mm.
be it justice, be it something in the neighborhood that is giving life into the neighborhood and those that live within it. Um, and the third one, so what did I have? I had neighborhood. I had, what was the first one? Um, and then try to find maybe one other thing that you can come alongside as community, come around as community. So it might be an anti-racist thing, might be reconciliation, and linger and journey for a long time towards that. And I think that's part of the exercise. That is part of our spiritual formation, to figure out what it means to put our bodies on the line and be transformed, to use Romans 12:1, and be transformed into a new thing, and hopefully light and hope for those in and outside of the community. So yeah, don't need to do it all, but find some I'm going to say simple, but find the one thing that you can come around as community and venture together, asking the hard questions. And it can start with who's around the table, who's in this community, and is it truly an inclusive community, or is this thing only built for insiders?
Mm. Absolutely. Thank you. So it looks like we have one question from Bill. He says, do you have an imagination for how predominantly monocultural churches can partner with more diverse churches and communities to more fully participate in the fullness of God?
Yeah, it's a good question, Bill. It's always the problem of, so I did a test, and there's also data on this around friendship networks. And so I tested social media, and then the sociologists actually tested churches. Um, White Protestants have the least diverse friendship networks, like 92 to 95%, same, all white folks. Now, like, I mean, for those who have more diverse friends, you'll say, oh, but not me, not all white people. The point is, the answer we always say simplistically is expand your relational circles. But how do you do that without tokenizing, right? Because everyone's got that one black friend, right? Or that one brown friend, or that one Asian friend. Or so how can we build the relational connective pieces that I started off talking about? It's how we're relationally connected to one another that matters. So I think that there can be relational connections between churches, church bodies, so the church as a whole, and other churches for sure. What we need, however, is patience, and the patience for us to linger over time to develop those relationships. I use the story of Tony and how I was trying to find out more about decolonizing Christianity by asking indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. And I was just like, I don't want to bother you. Just send me some books. Give me a book list. I'll just do the book list. And none of them gave me a book, like not even a hint of an author. And what they did instead, however, was far more transformative. They gave me invitation to participate in community. So I think that's the answer in the small ways as we develop friendship and relational connection, to just try to venture with other communities, fund them. So often, especially in my nonprofit work, it's like, just send you money, like, but the relational piece is important as well, and add time, add the patience, along with some formative elements to both unlearn and also relearn in new ways. And maybe you have a hope. Like I said, to me, I wouldn't do that work, because to me, that is too hard. Like, I don't want to spend my time trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced to try to shift. And so I'm biased that way, and I cheat, because I don't want to lead a predominantly white congregation to do something they don't want to. I'm going to spend my time and energy trying to build more diverse spaces. So like I said, it's easier to start something new, which might be the answer for some of these monocultural churches, to fund something at arm's length. That would be neat. It doesn't have to be big, but throw some money towards something that's kind of already happening, and just champion that, and that can be a win. And yeah, otherwise, start the new thing. That's the answer, because shifting culture, especially for established churches, is so hard. It can be done, but that is hard work. So good luck, Bill. Thanks for the question.
It absolutely is hard work. Thank you for that. Super insightful. Yeah, it made me think of we had a webinar last year about anti-racism work in the church, and there were a lot of similar questions from a lot of pastors who were trying to figure out what that work looks like in their communities. And there are a bunch of different answers, but sometimes they're not the ones that feel obvious at the time. Sometimes it's easiest to support someone in doing what they're doing, and not worry about
the time.
Yeah.
Is the big piece, because I think a lot of churches think of mission or outreach like through those lenses, and those tend to be temporary or seasons.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a season of reaching out to the poor, or we're going to this is a long haul commitment of building relationships. Like, you don't just build friends to find new friends in a new season. Oh, that's a good
Friends
tweet.
aren't a project.
Oh, dang, we gotta write that down. That's a good one.
That's for the next book.
Yeah, I don't have an idea. Maybe.
Well, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions, so we will go ahead and wrap up for tonight. I thank everyone who joined us. Thanks again to Rohadi for sharing with us. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate all of your insight. And for those who don't already have the book, I highly recommend it. It's available, like I said, everywhere books are sold. And
40% off. Dang.
I know. Well, and it's funny that you said you started writing it for church leaders, and it's on sale for Pastor Appreciation Week or month. But yeah,
well,
it's a great book, regardless of where you sit within the church, I think. So thanks again to everyone for joining us, and the recording will be available sometime early to mid next week if you're interested in that. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.